All right, I just want to send a big thank you to the Protocol Labs team, Filecoin team for throwing a great event. Super exciting to be here, talk about refi, sustainability, and all the great work that's going on in the broader ecosystem. So as mentioned, I'm Wes Geisenberger. I help lead the fund, but I have some great team members here, including Jonathan Rakoff, who helped leads our government and policy efforts at the foundation. And as part of the HBAR Foundation, we're really focused on sustainability. And some of you may have seen some of the work that we've done. I threw up a couple headlines just to try to summarize how we're spending the fund that we announced earlier this year. And as part of that, it's not just a bunch of dollars that you see here on the screen, but it's actual dollars going to good use to grow the refi movement, grow the sustainability movement, and try to make the world more auditable so we actually understand how we're creating emissions, how we're creating new types of carbon sinks, or better proving that verified emission reductions are happening, but all the different infrastructure pieces in between. And so today, maybe to get started, I'd love to talk a little bit about what that cycle looks like, from why a lot of folks are investing in this area, in sustainability, why we hear ESG in the conversation, where does refi fit into that, and how we're investing to back it up. And so a lot of times it starts with something where a corporation, individual, or actor says we have some type of emissions reporting. We're emitting way too much for the planet, more than we can handle today. And what we need to do is invest in projects that are going to slow our emission rate, improve our carbon sink so that we get a healthier planet. And of course, from a foundation perspective, we're saying, well, how do we invest in these critical pieces of infrastructure to support this cycle? Whether it's forwards, bonds, futures, any pre-money in the finance cycle that creates auditable projects that ultimately we can create credits from that are discoverable and tradable, but ultimately match up to the types of emissions that are being created in a very liquid market, but still yet auditable to the metric ton, auditable to the megawatt hour, and that work for compliance, reporting, and disclosures. And so what it looks like when you kind of bring this out into a cycle is we break it out into different areas of project funding. Now, some of these funding sources can go into newer types of models that we've seen, whether it's NFTs as a fundraising mechanism, but we also have the traditional models like green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, carbon forwards that are being brought to bear in traditional markets. And ideally, what we're looking to do is bring these on chain in a way that we can understand that the funding going to the projects is proportionally fair, that the validation and verification bodies aren't just coming into a project and saying, well, as part of this, I'll do the validation and verification, but we want the credits at 50 cents on a $50 credit, which isn't really what helps the social side of ESG. And so we want to make sure we understand how that project funding cycle works and invest in projects that believe in not just improving the environmental state, but doing it equitably as we create these new types of markets. And ideally, when we're taking this funding into projects, we're using new open source tools that ensure auditability, that we know all the roles, the actors who fill those roles within a methodology, and we can trust the data that they produce. And so we've actually gone ahead and invested in some of this critical infrastructure, and we created a tool called the Guardian to help anyone who's creating any type of credit and wants to map a methodology with auditable roles and actors through a tool that anyone can access today on the Hashgraph GitHub called the Guardian, and start to build a policy for your own use case. And that use case can go in a bunch of different areas and methodologies that we're actively investing in. And so the areas you see in green are areas where we've already made investments, or in the bright green are the areas where we already have made investments, but the other areas are soon to be invested in. Whether it's new types of technology projects, new types of biodiversity projects where there may be even folks building on Hedera today, but we haven't yet made an active investment in. And those are what we call the market supply. And this dynamic, what we're trying to do is every type of methodology has an auditable supply. All the roles and actors are mapped out to scientifically verified standards that we can ultimately use to create trusted assets on Hedera. From that point, we may have created a bunch of data. It could have come from IoT sensors. It could have come from manual data entry or somewhere in between, such as drones, satellites, or any other format. And we need to bring that load of data onto Hedera, and we need to have aggregators who can support that. And so we've made active investments in explorers and mirrors, some that'll be announced very shortly, in terms of being able to aggregate that data, understand the history and the context of that data in the form of VCs or verified credentials and decentralized identifiers that can be read, parsed, and used in other forms of marketplaces. But on top of those data aggregation points, we can also create things like indexes, third-party data registries, whether it's partnering with Oracle providers or looking at different third-party data sources that may not be on a DLT yet today. And building ultimately what we look for is a data library to not just understand the data sources, but how they map to the methodologies in a fully auditable manner, so we can actually build reputations on even the non-Web3 data sources that are out there. And ultimately, that feeds into trading, right? It helps us inform the value of the credits that we have. It helps us create new types of trading systems. So one of the big investments that we're really excited about is something called an automated regression market. And for folks who don't know about the ARM, we've put out a little bit of information, but in short, it's an automated market maker for non-fungible or semi-fungible assets. And so this idea that any credit that comes out of a renewable energy source or a verified emission reduction or any nature-based solution is a commodity is something we had trouble with. And so we said, well, how can we better trade these assets while retaining all their attributes, additionality, durability, leakage, not just what vintage it was, but also what subsection of a methodology did we use. In something like a Red Plus credit, you may want to know if they've accounted for soil storage or what type of data capture tools they used. And that all should be part of the trading aspect of the credit, inform the value based on the data depth as well as the individual attributes. And so the ARM gives us the ability to do that contextually, to search based on what folks in the ESG world are looking for to buy, and ultimately do that in a way that it's a search interface with completely liquid querying on those assets themselves. And so that's something we're excited to see hopefully go live later this year, in the coming months. And that feeds into what we call the market demand, which feeds back to the Guardian, where we get granularly traceable carbon emissions tokens, which work very similarly to our carbon offsets. And so when someone's a big corporate emitter, they can take their Scope 1 carbon emissions tokens. And one thing I do want to promote is there's some really great, for folks who aren't as familiar with the emissions trading side, there's some really great standards bodies to get involved in. One of them is the Interwork Alliance, who is launching a carbon emissions task force to define what Scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions tokens look like. And on Hedera, a lot of folks are building that on the Guardian. And we'll talk about a couple of those use cases later. When it comes beyond that, we're going to look at things like reporting, so why folks buy it. So just going back to that entire emissions reporting cycle, emissions and disclosure cycle. But ultimately, folks are investing in these credits because they want to meet those standards, help us get to the 1.5 degree target and not let it slip to 2. And they're using those reporting standards to do so. So that's kind of how we're looking at it from a Hedera perspective. But when we look at it on a flow perspective, we can map this out a little more simply into supply and demand. And with market standards, we build on top of, we take things like Vera gold standard in credits, and we map those to the actors on the Guardian. And we take those policies, digital signatures, and map them to device systems and people. And that comes back to some of the core services we have at Hedera. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Hedera, it's a layer 1 that looks to challenge the other layer 1s out there, but address the trilemma style issues: throughput, security, governance, and stability, and support that with some key services that are interoperable with all those other layer 1s out there, including a Hyperledger Bezu EVM, so EVM compatible, but also has different services than maybe some other folks have, including our consensus service, which you can think as an auditable or decentralized message queue, where you get timestamps from all the different nodes on the network, or 2/3 of the nodes in the network, so we get full consensus. And we have a token service which can send tokens at tens of thousands of transactions a second, so that you can basically see the balance and state of something like a carbon credit, an emissions token. And if you want to see the balance sheet of a public ledger, you can do it directly on the ledger because those tokens are native, and you can see the auditable link to something like a consensus service message, which is actually how our DID spec works. The Guardian ultimately can create these tokens with an auditable link from all the roles and actors to the balance itself. You can hold it in a wallet just like you would for any token on Hedera, and that can be traded in any of the marketplaces or ARMs. And anyone can interact with it, whether it's an individual, an enterprise, or a government agency who just wants to see what the audit trail looks like on a given asset. And so as I mentioned, our core services are a smart contract service, a consensus service, and a token service. But if you want to just simplify it, Hashgraph is the consensus mechanism. It feeds into the state balance of Hedera for the tokens. Those tokens, I do want to point out, are interoperable, even though they're native, with the EVM. So you can actually get the best out of programmability from Hedera, as well as get the best out of having the optimized native token state with tens of thousands of transactions a second. So when we go to create these fair markets, one of the things we're really excited about is we can handle events from the real world. So using the native features of Hashgraph. That means when we want to pull in IoT data points, we can do it with trust at the edge across tens of thousands of devices every second. But in practicality, when devices are reporting every 5 minutes and 15 minutes, that scales to tens of millions of devices in the real world. We have finality within 3 to 5 seconds. And we can do it with very low fees. So the average cost for a consensus service message, that could be something like an IoT sensor saying I've created X amount of kilowatt hours of energy, is 1/100th of a penny, and to create a token is a 1/10th of a penny. And we can do that with fairness to submit to any node on the network, with fair access, and a fair, unique timestamp not put within a block for every transaction that's out there. And so this maps to the Guardian, as I showed before, but for folks who aren't familiar with the Guardian, it's out there on GitHub, and it feeds the trusted token workflow from a sensor. It doesn't have to necessarily be from a sensor, it could be from any data point, but ultimately you can think of the Guardian as a digital measurement, reporting, and verification tool. And so DMRV is one of the big areas that we hear folks talking about in refi. And we're really bullish on it at Hedera. We're big fans of folks in the community like Refi DAO who are hosting things like World MRV Day and promoting this idea that we need more auditability in the space. And with the Guardian, we try to make that easy so that anyone can pick up a policy or a methodology, and in a few weeks have an MVP or a fully featured policy working, so that you can build your own methodology that maps to the roles and actors for your specific project. And so whether you have a rec project, an offset project, or a conservation project, if you want to pull a standard that's out there, maybe it's from Gold Standard or Vera or IREC, the idea is that you can take an example, and we have both examples from IREC and Vera in our repo today that you can work with. You should be able to pull that, adjust it to meet the scientific standard, or maybe build a new standard that doesn't yet exist for a technology solution like direct air capture, so you can mint tokens that you can understand the attributes from, whether it's, I want to know exactly how the baseline was calculated, all the additionality attributes linked to the DIDs and verifiable credentials in the Guardian, which ultimately, when I retire it, I can prove that. Now, why would you want to prove that? Well, because if somebody challenges that your credits aren't high quality, you can basically see, I know exactly what standard registry or root authority it was following the rules from. Maybe I want to know who the validation and verification body was. Maybe I don't trust them, or maybe I do. Maybe I want to challenge the process, or I want to challenge the data. But ultimately, you can take that down, and this is a simplified slide that shows kind of a trust chain, as we call it, of three different roles and how they're related. But the idea is you can follow that chain down to the individual device and how that device was certified, how that individual was certified, who maybe even certified the device, and how they follow the rules from that registry. And what we get is a system of trust linked back to the attribute that that data is linked to. And what it looks like in a larger framework, as you'll see here, when we build this out into more complexity, is you can have somebody created a policy. It could be a university, it could be a registry like Vera or Gold Standard, and you can say, well, even without their attestation, I can build a specification where that policy is implemented. We call it a standard registry or a root authority, where that policy lives. Now, if you want to be very formal, you can take that specification, get it formally verified with all the rules from an auditor. And from that, you can lay out the roles and actors. So first-party data could be something like a sensor. Second-party data could be a partner that you have. And that partner could be putting in manually attested data. And you may want to say, well, if it's manually attested and this partner has a monopoly on a specific county or region, maybe I want them to insure that. I know there's folks like Auditable out there who do parametric insurance on this area, but you could also assign a reputation so that if there is too much risk on a specific area, you could closely monitor the data that they're producing, the standards they're following, and the quality that they're working on. So then you can marry it with third-party data, stuff that comes from oracles or third-party sources, to prove whether something is true. And after you've added all these data points together, you can run that through the Guardian, which is just helping process and put a taxonomy on this information with DIDs and verifiable credentials. And you can eventually get to a point where you mint a token, which is a carbon credit, a carbon emission, something following a methodology or a process of rules that is auditable within the market. And what the market will be able to see, going back to our data aggregators, is those different points and the roots of trust that come from them. How we trust those attributes following the DIDs and verifiable credentials that they can ultimately query, trade, they can even retire them and say, I've retired a token with these attributes on it, following a very complex digital measurement reporting and verification technology. And so we have a couple examples I like to talk about in maybe a more simplified way, but that follow those complex sets of rules. One of them was our first grantee named Dovu. They have been a really great success for us. They've actually been selling out credits, and so they've built a soil organic carbon methodology working with farmers. One of the things that I'm really excited about that Dovu has been working on is they can actually scale down to as small as a 2.5 hectare farm. And in the carbon markets, one of the things we look to beyond just digitizing these methodologies and assets that come from the methodologies is scaling the validation and verification process. There's only so many validation and verification bodies in the world. And with Dovu, they've been able to scale beyond, say, the Vera validation and verification bodies to create very high quality credits. And so their last batch of credits came from this winery, which is a 2.5 hectare farm, as I mentioned, and they sold them for $93 US dollars a metric ton. They didn't sell very many of them, but because it's a small farm, but they proved that there's a possible way to create high quality credits without having to go through one of the large registries. And I think that's really admirable in the sense that we need to show a model to the world where not just 27 parties control the creation of 80+% of the voluntary market, but we need to be able to create a world where you scale validation and verification so that it can happen in your backyard, whether that's in sub-Saharan Africa, anywhere here in Europe or North America, or locally within a specific community. And with Dovu, I think they've shown that. So one other example, though, which is very different, is a verified emission reduction use case we're doing in Kenya with a group called Tamu. And so Tamu, they produce biomass briquettes. It comes out of milling of sugarcane. And what they're doing is they're creating these briquettes that are focused on collecting and protecting the environment from noxious gases, including methane, and turning that into a process where you create a high caloric value briquette that burns more efficiently than wood, which is very common in the Kenyan tea industry. Kenyan tea industry is a hundreds of millions of dollar industry where tea is creating a lot of different greenhouse gases. And what Tamu has done is they've created a provable method. They've actually put out quite a few reports on this area, and they'll be creating credits this year on Hedera for folks who are interested and looking more into it. But the idea behind it is they can just create a carbon marketplace for the region called Sync. And Sync ultimately enables folks to get access to their credits, but it also works with folks who haven't yet created DMRV methods that they can ultimately create digitized credits in the region as well. Now I want to flip to the other side of the market. So we talked a little bit about supply, but from a demand side, one that we're really excited about and is measuring quite a bit in the carbon emission space is Atma.io. So how many here, just by show of hands, have heard of Avery Dennison? So if you see about maybe a small handful, dozen folks. If you look in the back of the collar of your shirt, there's probably a little triangle logo on it. That's Avery Dennison. It's usually a red logo, similar to the one you see here. And they're actually the world's largest RFID manufacturer. And so one of the areas that we're really excited to partner with them on is creating scalable carbon emissions. And going back to that circular logo that I started the presentation with. And the idea is we're not just building the supply side of the market, not just creating credits, but we also need to have granular emissions accounting so we can actually prove that the emissions are real, that they're accurate, that they come from trusted supply chain processes. And what Atma.io is doing is creating unique identifiers for each item, whether it's a salmon fillet like you see here on the screen, a pair of shoes, or an airplane wing. And the idea is the world's largest RFID manufacturer as well as digital trigger manufacturer is that we can take these granular assets, follow the model in the Guardian to create trusted tokens that ultimately allow people to report better. And this can be major Fortune 500 companies or small and medium-sized businesses. But the idea is we can get granular traceability on both sides of the market and improve our disclosures and methodologies and DMRV systems on either side. And so that's really what Hedera, what we're looking to do is promote auditability on both sides of the market. We want to prove it not just in the environmental side of the methodology, but the social side to make sure folks are getting paid, that they're reporting properly, and making sure that we're paying the folks who are doing the work. And we're doing this in a liquid way that doesn't cause a lot of friction. And so as we go to take the next steps, we encourage you all to engage with us on our journey towards auditability, discoverability, liquidity, and see where we can help you and how we can help you take your first steps on the journey to Hedera. We have a large fund. We encourage everyone to apply for funding. We also encourage folks to get started just working with the open source code on things like the Guardian. We're always looking for active contributors. And with that, I'll probably open it up to questions and just say thank you all for having me. So.